They say Dustwood Ridge was never born, only exhaled by the desert after a long, mean breath. Back in 1887, it crouched low between red rock cliffs like something hiding from God, baking under a sun too tired to show mercy. Winds howled through the canyon like old ghosts dragging chains, and folks said that if you listened close at dusk, you could hear the crying of women who vanished into the dust. It was outlaw country, no law but the kind written in blood, and the man who held the pen was Caleb Brandt. Caleb was the sort of man the prairie birthed wrong. Too tall, too silent, with eyes like dried bone and hands that never trembled, not even when they killed. Folks in Dustwood didn't speak his name louder than a whisper. Not after the preacher disappeared. Not after the sheriff was found hanging from his own badge. But it wasn't just the killing that made Brandt feared. It was the women. He didn't take many, just 3. Maybe 4 that folks could count. But once he claimed them, they were his. He kept them like prized horses, locked in rooms with barred windows and shamed eyes. But he never broke them, not truly. That was what made them dangerous. Maggie Doyle stirred beans in the back of the Dustwood saloon, her arms browned by sun and scarred by grease, her eyes sharp as razors behind the soot. Her husband had died 5 winters ago, gutted by a drunk miner in a card game that didn't matter. She'd buried him with her own hands. Then she got back to cooking. Maggie didn't cry. She boiled. Across the alley, inside a dim shack that used to be a seamstress shop, Rosalia Ortega threaded a bone needle through thick denim, her hand steady, her back straight despite the bruises. She spoke little, but her eyes were full of old storms. Some said she crossed the Rio Grande hidden in a cart full of melons, fleeing soldiers. Others whispered she once slit a man's throat for calling her puta. No one knew for sure, and she never corrected them. And upstairs in the brothel-turned-prison that Caleb had converted for his wives, Ellie Parker danced alone in the flickering lamplight, her toes silent on cracked floorboards. Once she'd sung hymns beneath a wooden cross, her hair braided by sisters in Sunday white. But somewhere between her father's belt and the preacher's gaze, she'd learned that heaven wasn't meant for girls like her. Now she danced not for pleasure, not for men, but to remind herself she could still move on her own terms. Each of them was watched. Not by Caleb himself. He rarely needed to. He had men for that. Soulless shells and wide-brimmed hats who smiled like rattlesnakes and dragged iron chains behind them like dogs on leashes. They kept the women close, locked the doors, counted their steps. But they didn't watch close enough. Because the women weren't broken. Not yet. They met when they could, behind the saloon, under the stairs, in passing glances thick with meaning. Words weren't always needed. A dropped hairpin, a shift in routine, the way Ellie hummed a certain tune twice when a guard was drunk. All of it meant something. All of it moved the invisible clock they'd been building in silence. Maggie had fashioned a crude map in her head of every hallway in the saloon, every cellar door, every creaky floorboard. Rosalia had begun hoarding scraps of wire, bone, and cloth. Things no one noticed. Things she could twist into tools. Ellie had learned to unlock her door using a hair comb and a sliver of metal sheet hidden in her corset. Caleb suspected something. Maybe not the full truth, but enough to darken his stare when he looked at them. His kind of evil didn't trust. It devoured. One night, he called Maggie into the main room, made her serve whiskey to his men while they passed around cards and stories about women they'd hurt. One reached out to grab her wrist. Caleb broke his fingers in front of everyone. "She's mine," he said, and his voice was flat as a dry riverbed. Maggie didn't flinch. She stared right into his pale eyes, and in that second, a war was declared that neither of them named. By morning, the outlaw had one of his men chain Ellie to her bed. No warning, just iron and silence. Rosalia's sewing tools were thrown into the fire. Maggie was locked in the pantry for 3 days, with only a canteen. Still, they didn't break. They carved their hope out of misery, stitched it into secret glances and bruised hands. There was no cavalry coming, no white horse on the ridge. Dustwood Ridge was too far gone, too wrapped in dust and death for heroes. But sometimes they whispered to each other at night. Sometimes even chains could rust. Sometimes even hell left a back door open. "Freedom ain't something you're given," Maggie said once. her voice rough and low in the cellar shadows. "You steal it. With blood and grit." Ellie smiled through a busted lip. Rosalia nodded without speaking, fingers already working a bit of wire behind her back. Upstairs, Caleb drank alone beneath a lantern dimmed by soot, unaware of what he'd raised. Not slaves, not toys, not trophies. He'd raised a fire. 3 sparks flickering in different corners of dustwood, waiting for wind. And that wind was coming. They called it the Devil's Rope. The heavy, rust-colored chains that Caleb Brandt used on the women he claimed. Worn smooth by sun and skin, they hung like twisted vines across beds and beams, cold against wrists that once reached for freedom. Dustwood Ridge wore silence like second skin, but behind the locked doors, the truth had a voice. It groaned with the hinges. It wept through the floorboards. And it remembered how each woman had come to wear her own links in that wicked chain. Rosalia Ortega's first mistake had been kindness. She'd taken in a bleeding man off the trail, nursed him with broth and prayer, never knowing he was one of Brandt's men hiding from justice. When the outlaw came looking, he found not just his fugitive, but something he liked better. Rosalia fought. She kicked and bit, set fire to her own curtains trying to escape. But there were too many of them. Brandt didn't hit her. He never did. He only looked her in the eye as his men tied her wrists and said, "You're mine now. That's the cost of helping devils." Ellie Parker had fled from her father's house with hymns still echoing in her head. Her mother's grave was barely covered when the preacher started eyeing her like a man eyes meat. She ran west, thinking there'd be work in the saloons and kindness in strange towns. What she found was dustwood, and the man who ran it. Brandt paid her 3 silver coins to dance, then 5 more to stay. By the time she tried to leave, the saloon doors were nailed shut, and the window locks had been changed. Maggie Doyle didn't come to Brandt. He came for her. Word had reached him that the saloon's cook had once stabbed a drifter with a roasting fork and didn't flinch. He liked that. Said he needed a woman with steel in her veins to balance the softness of the others. He made her an offer. She told him to choke on it. The next morning, her cabin was in ashes, and her landlord was swinging from a cottonwood. When the dust cleared, Maggie stood between 2 of Brandt's men, arms bloodied, chin held high. He grinned at her like a man seeing his own reflection. "You'll learn," he said, "or you'll burn." But none of them learned the way he wanted. Not really. By lantern light, after the guards' boots faded down the hallway, the women began to stitch something bigger than just hope. It started with notes carved into wood with sewing needles, then grew into whispered riddles and foot taps under floorboards. Every time Rosalia handed Maggie a folded rag, it held not just scraps of cloth, but maps. Every time Ellie sang a certain lullaby, it meant a window had been left unlocked. They met in the shadows, where voices could barely rise above breath. "The guards get drunk on poker nights," Ellie whispered one night beneath the staircase, her knees scraped from crawling through the crawl space. "Last week, one of them passed out cold against my door." Maggie leaned in, her voice a soft growl. "We'd need 3 minutes, no more, just to get down the back alley. Rosalia, how fast can you pick a chain lock?" "Faster than Caleb can spit," Rosalia said. Their plan wasn't perfect, but perfection didn't live in dustwood. What they had was courage, pain-hardened and raw. They picked a Thursday, when Caleb would be drunk and laughing with his men, the devil's poker night in full swing. But hope, like a rope pulled too tight, can snap without warning. The girl who ran first wasn't one of the 3. Her name was Ruthie Bell, a quiet, bird-bone girl who scrubbed floors and rarely spoke. But she'd listened and learned. When Ellie left her door cracked that night, Ruthie slipped out barefoot, eyes wide and wild. She made it past the saloon kitchen, past the poker table where the guards howled and drank, but someone saw her shadow slip across the porch. A single yell cut the noise, and then came the thunder of boots. They caught her 10 paces from freedom. Maggie tried to run. Rosalia grabbed her wrist, held her back. "We do it now, we all hang," she hissed. Let them think she acted alone. The punishment came at dawn. The townspeople were forced to gather. Caleb liked crowds when he taught lessons. He stood on the saloon steps with Ruthie kneeling in the dust, her lips split, hands bound. The noose hung nearby, swaying gently in the breeze. "She stole," he told the crowd, voice dry as gravel. "She lied. And worst of all, she broke my trust." Ruthie didn't cry, didn't plead. Her face was still a child's, but her eyes were old in that moment. Ellie turned her face away. Rosalia didn't blink. Maggie dug her fingernails so deep into her palms that blood welled between her fingers. Caleb didn't hang her. He had her chained to a wagon wheel in the center of town, wrists high, back bare to the sun. Every hour, a different guard lashed her. The screams carried across dust wood like hymns from a broken church. That night, no one whispered. No plans were made. Just silence, thick and bitter. The cost of failure was etched into flesh and bone, and it would take days before Ruthie could even whisper again. But something had changed. Maggie sat beside Rosalia, oiling a rusted hinge with bacon grease, and spoke in a low voice. "We don't get another shot." Rosalia nodded. "Next time, we leave the weak behind." Ellie looked at both of them. "There won't be a next time. We either walk out of here in one piece, or not at all." They didn't argue. They were past that now. The devil's rope still clung to their wrists, but it no longer defined them. It reminded them. That pain didn't own them. That fear wasn't final, and that when the time came again, there'd be no false start. No mercy. Only fire. He rode into Dustwood Ridge like a ghost too tired to haunt. The mule he straddled looked half dead, one eye cloudy, ribs showing, hooves clopping unevenly across the dry-packed earth. The man riding it was worse, lean as hunger, hunched in the saddle, his coat torn at the shoulder and dust-caked to the knees. His hat drooped low over his brow, and a limp dragged behind him when he stepped down onto the street, slow and crooked like a broken fence post trying to walk. He called the mule Sabbath, though no one asked why. The townsfolk watched him from porches and windows, smirking behind whiskey cups and spit-stained teeth. Just another drifter come to vanish. They'd seen his kind before, dust-bitten, coinless, and destined for the bottom of a ditch. But he didn't beg, didn't barter. He just stood in front of the boarded-up chapel at the edge of town and played a tune on a dented harmonica, soft, mournful, so sweet it made even the wind hush to listen. Maggie heard the music while hauling a crate of potatoes into the saloon. It stopped her in her tracks. There was something sharp in the way it cut through the air, not desperate, not dulled. Intentional, calculated. She glanced toward the ruins of the chapel, her brow furrowing. The man standing there leaned against the stone like he'd grown out of it. He played for 5 minutes, then tucked the harmonica back into his coat and walked into town, asking only for stew and shade. Caleb's men laughed when they saw him, called him Old Limp, and bet on whether the mule would die before sundown. One offered the stranger a coin to dance. The man didn't respond, just stared at him with pale blue eyes like lake ice, unreadable and still. The laughter faded quick after that. He kept mostly to himself, sleeping near the chapel's broken bell tower, drinking water from a cracked canteen, feeding Sabbath bits of jerky with gentle hands. Some nights, Maggie watched him from the saloon window, noticing the way he moved. He limped, yes, but the limp was too controlled, too practiced. His eyes scanned every rooftop, every alley. A predator wrapped in rags. Then came the day of the bet. It started over a bottle of rye and a challenge. One of Caleb's men, Trip, the one with the silver tooth and a twitchy draw, was showing off with his Colt, firing bottles off fence posts behind the saloon. The stranger wandered over, chewing on a piece of dry root, watching without a word. "You want to turn, old man?" Trip jeered. "Hell, you even lift your arm, you'll fall over dead." The drifter didn't blink. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a round pebble the size of a marble, and flicked it between his fingers. "Double or nothing," he said, his voice a slow rasp. "You hit one more. I hit two." Trip barked a laugh. "With what? That mule's gonna throw rocks for you." The stranger pulled out a slingshot, a real weathered thing, wood smoothed by use, leather band tight and clean. The bet was made. Trip took a shot, smashed the neck off a bottle at 20 paces. Then the stranger stepped forward, loaded the pebble, and fired. One bottle shattered. Then, without pausing, He reloaded, adjusted for wind, and fired again. Second bottle gone. The silence that followed was heavy. Tripp's grin died on his face. The stranger just tipped his hat, took the money, and walked back toward Sabbath. From a second-floor window, Caleb Brandt watched everything. That night, the drifter got an invite. They brought him to the saloon's main room, where Brandt sat in his carved chair like a man on a throne. The outlaw's eyes didn't blink much, didn't smile either. "You got good hands for a cripple," he said. The stranger shrugged. "Don't need legs to shoot." "What's your name?" "Harper." "Harper what?" "Just Harper." Maggie stood at the bar, drying glasses. She caught the name and froze. Brandt leaned forward. "You looking for work, Harper?" "Just looking to eat." "You ever work with iron?" The drifter looked up slowly. "I worked with devils." Caleb stared at him a long moment, then laughed, short and low, like a dog growling at a joke. "Well, Dustwood's full of those. Maybe you'll feel right at home." The next morning, Maggie approached him while he sat near the chapel, whittling a piece of wood into the shape of a bird. "You're not who you say," she said quietly. He didn't look up. "Neither are you." "I've seen your eyes before," she said. "Years ago. You had a badge then." He sighed, set down the carving. "That man died in Arizona. Shot in the back. Left in a ravine with 6 bullets and a broken leg. The bastards didn't check if I was breathing." She stepped closer, heart thudding. "Brent." He nodded. "Name burned into my ribs. I was Pinkerton. We were tracking him for trafficking, extortion, murder. Got too close. And now you're here. I'm here to finish it." Later that evening, Rosalia found Maggie near the cellar and pulled her into the shadows. "That man," she whispered. "Jonas Harper. He helped my mother and brothers cross the river 6 years ago. Saved our lives. He had a limp even then, but it wasn't real. He wore it to get past patrols." They sat in the dark, listening to the creak of the saloon floor above them. "We can trust him," Rosalia said. "He's not a drifter. He's fire waiting for wind." By the week's end, the plan was set. Jonas mapped out guard rotations. Rosalia hid weapons beneath the floorboards. An old revolver with only 4 bullets. A blade she'd carved from a kitchen hook. Maggie baked a key into a pie crust and served it with supper. Ellie seduced the drunkest guard and slipped a sleeping draft into his whiskey. This time, there would be no false starts. No Ruthie to pay the price. Jonas would light the fuse. The women would fan the flames. Dustwood Ridge didn't know it yet, but its reckoning had arrived. Not on a stallion, not with a cavalry, but with a limp, a harmonica, and 3 women who'd bled long enough. Night settled over Dustwood Ridge like a shroud. The moon was a thin blade behind clouds, and the wind had gone quiet, as if the land itself held its breath. Inside the saloon, laughter rose like smoke from a dying fire. Brandt's men were drinking deep, their poker table cluttered with broken chips and spilled rye. No one noticed Maggie slip away from the kitchen. No one noticed the trapdoor behind the pantry swing open. Below the floorboards, the earth was cool and close. Jonas led the way through the narrow tunnel, stooped low, the revolver holstered at his hip gleaming dully. His limp had vanished. Behind him, Rosalia crept barefoot, a blade tucked in her sash. Ellie followed last, her fingers shaking slightly as she clutched the lantern, careful to shield the flame. The tunnel smelled of clay and mold, and the silence was thick with a single thought shared between them. This was it. They had spent weeks digging it out in secret, Jonas marking the path by memory. An old root cellar turned escape route, long forgotten by most. It ran beneath the saloon, snaked under the alleyway, and curved toward the canyon pass, where Sabbath waited with packs of food, ammo, and 1 bullet for each of them. Their breath echoed in the damp corridor. Maggie paused to listen, then nodded once. "Go." They climbed a narrow ladder to the far exit, hidden behind a collapsed shed. Ellie pushed the hatch open and felt fresh air touch her face for the first time in weeks, without a chain between her wrists. She almost smiled. And then it all went wrong. The shot came from the ridge, sharp and cracking, a warning. Jonas froze. Another shot rang out, closer, followed by a shout from above. "They're here!" A voice howled. They're running. Within seconds, the sound of galloping hooves echoed through the canyon. The women ducked instinctively, pulling their weapons. From the shadows, a figure emerged, wide-eyed and breathless. It was Clara, the saloon-serving girl. She raised her hands. "I'm sorry," she cried. "They made me tell. He said he'd kill my brother." Jonas didn't curse. He just turned, face hollow, and hissed, "Move." The canyon exploded with gunfire. Brant's men poured down the rocky slopes, rifles flashing, boots thundering across stone. Jonas dove behind a boulder, drawing both pistols with one fluid motion, his body alive with grace and violence. He fired left and right, 2 slugs dropping 2 sharpshooters before they hit the dirt. Maggie returned fire from behind a wagon, her knuckles white on the stock. Rosalia knelt beside her, reloading in silence, her face set like stone. Ellie darted to the far side of the canyon, drawing fire away from the others, her small silhouette dancing like a flame through the chaos. Jonas moved like no one they had ever seen, pivoting on his heel, dodging bullets by inches, using his slingshot mid-firefight to shatter lanterns and blind the shooters. He fired one pistol, then the other, then both at once. 3 men fell in the space of a breath. "Down," he shouted, dragging Maggie clear as a bullet split the rock beside her ear. "They knew," Rosalia muttered, face grim. "They were waiting." "Not all of them," Jonas said. "Brant's not here yet." But he was coming. The thunder of his horse echoed down the pass. Ellie reached the bluff where the ridge narrowed and turned to cover the others, rifle in hand. She fired, then again, dropping a man from his saddle. Then a shot rang out from the opposite ledge. She cried out, staggered, blood blooming through her dress. Rosalia screamed. Maggie turned in time to see Ellie stumble to her knees, still trying to lift the rifle. "Go," Ellie gasped. "Get her out." Rosalia ran to her, but Jonas held her back. "She's gone," he said flatly. "We move now, or none of us make it." A final look. Ellie's breath came in short bursts, her eyes locked on Rosalia's. "I wasn't afraid," she whispered. "Not this time." She slumped forward. Jonas grabbed the mule's reins, shoved supplies into Maggie's hands, and dragged Rosalia toward the trail. Behind them, smoke was rising, black coils slithering up the canyon walls. Jonas had rigged the saloon with oil and powder before they'd left. "Cover your ears," he said. The explosion lit the sky like thunder-made flame. The ground trembled. A wall of fire roared up into the stars, devouring the saloon, the stables, and the men still inside. Brant's fortress, his empire of cruelty, cracked like brittle bones. Screams echoed through the pass. But Jonas didn't stop. He pushed forward, firing behind him without looking. They ran past burning fences, through smoke and falling ash. Then, like a shadow drawn by fury, Caleb Brant appeared. He rode through the fire, his coat burning at the edges, his eyes glowing with madness. He leapt from the saddle, tackling Jonas to the ground. The 2 men rolled in the dust, fists flying, guns kicked aside. They grappled like wolves, old, ragged, merciless. "You should have died in that ravine," Brant spat. Jonas snarled. "You should have checked my pulse." Maggie picked up Jonas's pistol and stepped forward. "No," Jonas said, bloodied, breathing hard. "He's mine." But Maggie shook her head. "No, he's ours." She dragged the length of iron chain from her pack, the very same one she'd once worn, and swung it around Brant's neck, jerking him backward. He clawed at it, sputtering. She kicked his legs out, pinned him against a post that had once tethered Ellie. With the others watching, Maggie wrapped the chain around the beam 3 times and clicked the padlock shut. Brant thrashed. "You can't." She leaned in close. "You made your own fire, Caleb. We just fanned it." The flames grew louder. The building behind him collapsed, sparks leaping into the sky. Heat painted their faces orange. "No mercy," Rosalia whispered. Jonas lit a match and dropped it into the dry hay around Brant's boots. They turned away as the screaming began. By dawn, Dustwood Ridge was gone. The wind had returned, whistling low through the ash and cinders. Sabbath stood quiet as stone, waiting near the edge of the canyon. The three of them, Jonas, Maggie, and Rosalia, did not speak. They mounted up and rode, leaving behind fire, chains, and the ghosts of the broken. And behind them, the land began to forget Dustwood Ridge ever existed. They rode out of Dustwood Ridge just after dawn, the wind cool against their faces, carrying the scent of ash and the silence of finality. Smoke still curled in the distance like the last breath of a dying beast, but the flames had done their work. What had once been a stronghold of cruelty and chains was now little more than scorched timber and smoldering memory. No one followed. No one dared. Maggie, Rosalia, and Jonas did not speak for miles. They didn't need to. The air between them was heavy with the weight of everything they'd lost, and everything they'd taken back. Ellie's name lived quietly on each breath, a ghost they carried not with sorrow, but reverence. She had walked into fire, so they could ride into freedom. By mid-morning, they reached the edge of the canyon, where the land opened up into sunlit prairie. Maggie turned in her saddle for one last look. Dustwood Ridge lay far behind, distant and ruined, the Devil's Playground reduced to smoke and silence. The wind blew east, as if eager to scatter its ashes. Rosalia reached into her coat and pulled out the length of chain she had kept. Just one link, cooled from the fire, warped and blackened. She held it in her palm for a moment before tossing it into the grass. "Let the earth bury what we survived," she murmured. They parted ways at a fork in the road 2 days later, beneath a sky painted in crimson dusk. Jonas packed light, just a satchel and his harmonica, and mounted Sabbath, with a quiet nod. He didn't say goodbye. He never had much use for words. Rosalia watched him disappear down the southern trail. "Where do you think he's going?" "Where the next wound is," Maggie said. "That's the kind of man he is." Rumors started not long after. They spread through stagecoach stations and campfires, whispered in border towns, and printed in dime store pages. Tales of a burned-out outlaw town ruled by a monster, of a stranger with a limp who could kill at 50 paces with nothing but a slingshot and fury, of 3 women with chains around their wrists and fire in their eyes who tore the devil from his throne and turned his kingdom to dust. Children asked their mothers about the chained women. Drifters claimed they saw Jonas Harper by a riverbank in New Mexico, playing Amazing Grace on a battered harmonica, then vanishing before the last note ended. Some said he was an angel. Others said he was the devil's twin, turned against his own. But Maggie didn't chase stories. She settled in the town of Larkspur, built a small diner with her bare hands, and cooked with the same fire she once carried through the saloon. She named it Ellie's Place. A painting of wild horses hung behind the counter. If anyone asked her where she learned to make stew that could warm a soul clean through, she just smiled and said, "Old recipe, passed down in hell." Rosalia went farther west and opened a schoolhouse in Sierra Blanca, high in the hills where the air was sharp and clean. The children there were mostly girls, orphans, runaways, cast-offs from mining camps and railroad towns. She taught them how to read, how to sew, and how to fight with whatever they had. On the wall above her desk, she nailed a sign that read, "*, you were not born to be owned." *. Sometimes she'd sit alone after the students left, staring out at the desert horizon, her fingers absently tracing the scar on her wrist where Caleb Brandt's chain had once bitten. She didn't wear jewelry, didn't need to. Her strength was its own adornment. Years passed, but the legend didn't fade. If anything, it grew. People spoke of Dustwood Ridge, like a ghost town cursed by justice. The wind through its ruined buildings moaned like it mourned what had happened, and what had ended. No one rebuilt. No one claimed the land. It was as if the earth itself had swallowed the shame and refused to give it back. The tale found its way into storybooks and songs. Ballads were sung in taverns by men with trembling voices, their hands brushing old scars. One line repeated more than any other. *, the crippled man who stood tall, and the women who burned hell to the ground. *, but legends don't linger forever in the mouths of strangers. They settle in quieter places, within hearts, within memories, within the bones of those who lived them. And on one twilight evening, years after the fire, Maggie stood at the back door of her diner, watching the sun sink behind the hills, her apron dusted with flour, the smell of baked bread curling into the wind. A harmonica tune floated through the dusk, soft, slow, familiar. She stepped outside, heart hammering, eyes searching the fading road. But there was no one there, just the wind and the sound of hooves far off in the distance. She smiled to herself, eyes wet but unashamed. Sometimes justice don't ride in on a white horse. Sometimes she walks in on bloodied feet and leaves behind ashes.